Welcome to the Nick Blevins Family Ministry Podcast. Our goal is to help you maximize your church's potential. You'll hear from top leaders in children's, student, and family ministry about the principles and practices they use. Now here's your host, Nick Blevins.
Hey everybody, hope you're doing well this week after Easter. I hope Easter was amazing for your church and for people at your church, and I hope people invited, and whether you serve in kids ministry or student ministry or some other area. I hope this weekend was a great weekend of holding up the name of Jesus and introducing people to God and helping them take steps in their faith and all of that, if you're listening to this when it comes out. But I don't know about you, but after a week like that and even the things we do leading up to that, this week is a good week to rest and relax and maybe catch up and think ahead a little bit after planning for everything that surrounds Easter. We do some big things for our kids and student ministry kind of around Easter and even a little bit after. So that's my world. That's what I'm doing this week. And I'm excited to share with you this interview that I had with Kurt Johnston, the Kurt Johnston of Saddleback Church. He's just an amazing leader in church world and has done great things in student ministry and for so long, specifically junior high ministry, middle school ministry. But now Kurt oversees the whole kids and students team at Saddleback. We talk a little bit about that, but we really talk about the student ministry landscape. Why are so many churches struggling with high school students? You know, that's something that I get Kurt's thoughts on. What does the strategy look like at Saddleback? Has it changed a lot in the last 5 to 10 years? And if so, what does that look like? Now, I have to give you a heads up that there were some audio issues. We had a little bit of an issue with the quality coming through on the call. That happens sometimes, but it was too good to not use this interview or anything like that. So we tried to fix it up as best we could. Sometimes the audio cut out. So if there's kind of a gap there, you'll understand, but it'll be easy to understand what he was talking about and where he was headed. And if you don't hear me, that's better anyway. So without any further ado, let's jump into my interview with Kurt Johnston about student ministry strategies. Today I'm talking with Kurt Johnston. Welcome to the podcast, Kurt.
Hey, Nick, how you doing?
I'm doing well, Kurt. I imagine most people listening know of you, but for anyone who doesn't and doesn't know about Saddleback, which that might be hard to believe, but tell us a little bit about yourself and your church and your ministry.
Yeah, sure. Well, Saddleback Church, if listeners aren't aware of Saddleback, Saddleback Church is a church out in Southern California. Our senior pastor is Rick Warren. So sometimes people don't know the name of the church, but they recognize Rick Warren's name. He's been around a while, wrote Purpose Driven Life. He's the founding pastor of our church. This year is our 39th year that we're celebrating, and I've been at Saddleback for 21 years. Been in youth ministry since 1988. Have been at Saddleback since 97, and up until about 7 or 8 years ago, from 1988 all the way up until 7 or 8 years ago, my whole ministry career was focused purely on junior high. That's kind of my sweet spot. That's the age that I tend to gravitate towards from a ministry standpoint. But about 8 years ago, I was asked to lead the student ministries team here, and then we started launching multiple campuses. We currently have 20 campuses. We have 16 here in Southern California, and then 4 international campuses, one in Buenos Aires, one in Berlin, one in Manila, and one in Hong Kong. So I oversee junior high and high school and college at all of those campuses. And then about 6 months ago, we did sort of an organizational shift and a restructure, and for the first time for us ever, sort of a next-gen team. And so now I get the privilege of leading the children's through college teams for all of our campuses. So that's kind of what I do at Saddleback.
All right. Yeah, lots of time there. That's awesome. You've been there that long. And, of course, they're coming up on 40 years, which is just really cool. Saddleback is – I mean, if you could pick probably a handful of churches that have shaped, I think, the American church in the last, 30 years, and Saddleback's definitely one of them, for sure. Yeah. For me, too. I remember before I ever thought I'd even work on staff at a church, I was a volunteer in student ministry, and I had read Purpose Driven Church, and I read Purpose Driven Youth Ministry from Doug Fields. And it was like the first time there was ever like, hey, there's like information about how to do this. Like, I don't just have to make it up. Like somebody's written some stuff down, which is really cool.
And Purpose Driven Youth Ministry, that book, in fact, 2018. So it's 20 years old this year. And, most youth workers would say it's in their little short list of most influential youth ministry books they've read.
Yeah, it is. Well, it was just so practical. And even some of the things you've written too, they're very practical. And I know for me, again, that was the first exposure I had to anything that was like ministry specific beyond Purpose Driven Church. You know what I mean? Yeah. And so to get real practical, and it was super practical. And, so it was. I could see why people would point to that. I didn't know you guys had 20 campuses. That is a lot of growth.
Yeah, it's crazy. Well, we started launching multi-sites about 10 years ago, but we only had one for a couple years, and then we launched 3 at once, and then we've just kind of cranked them up ever since. And a few years ago, we decided to try international, the multi-site thing with your senior pastor on video in a cross-cultural context. It's been awesome. It's just been a lot of work and a lot of learning.
Yeah, I bet. That's awesome. So we're going to talk student ministry, but before we do that, I feel like we have to talk about this transition you've made to Next Gen because, we've had a number of people on the podcast who are Next Gen pastors. I get questions all the time about, hey, I'm new to this role. I used to be a student pastor. I used to be a kids pastor. How do I do it? So you're 6 months in. What have you learned? What's it been like? Tell us a little about it so far.
Well, I think I need to preface it in one way is that for us, it didn't start out, and I'm not even sure if we're there yet, as a massive strategic morphing of kids and youth into a next gen team. It really was the result of a reorg throughout our organization, throughout our whole church staffing structure, where we just had to kind of consolidate some teams into a cleaner leadership structure, I guess. And so when you're looking at what teams go together, well, hey, children and youth, they kind of go together better than we can't combine youth and the tech team. So, it makes sense to combine youth and children. And so that was kind of the impetus. And since then, it's become a little bit more strategic and a little bit more of a, hey, these two teams do go well together. And so for us to kind of put the two under one roof felt okay. And now it's kind of my role. And really what I've been focusing on, Nick, is I just love collaboration. I love unity of vision and resources when we can share stuff. I hate redundancy. And so for me, it's been a little bit more of how do we take these two really high functioning teams with high caliber leaders doing great ministry and morph us where we can without stifling or making it feel controlling. So just looking for ways that we can where's the common threads that we can thread all the way from nursery all the way through college, where are the common threads, where can we partner in transitions better, how can our scope and sequence of curriculum work together a little bit more than it ever has in the past. Some of those just kind of low-hanging fruit, but I'm mostly just trying to learn as much as I can about children's ministry because I just have never had to think much about it. And I just want to represent that team really, really well.
So far, I know it's early, but do you feel like in what you're learning about children's ministry, I think a lot of next-gen pastors would say this, do you see a lot of the commonality? You know what I mean? Where it looks different, the ministry's done different, but there's groups and there's teaching and there's volunteers and there's leadership. A lot of it's the same. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I think like so much in ministry, Nick, I think the principles are almost identical. For me personally, I've just completely grown in my appreciation of what kids ministry is all about. The level of detail and the level of care and the level of intentionality, the importance of the parent and how you communicate to parents and earn their trust in children's ministry versus youth ministry, to me has been maybe my biggest learning curve and a lot of aha moments in there for me. It was interesting when I first started working with the kids ministry, I got together one-on-one with the excuse me, I got a little bit of a cough today. I got together one-on-one with the 5 key department leaders of children's ministry, and I said to them, hey, what's one thing that our youth group could learn from kids ministry, and what's one thing kids ministry could learn from our youth group? And I asked all 5 separately that question, and Nick, they were 100% consistent, 5 for 5 on both questions.
Wow.
And yeah, I know, it's crazy. And the answer they all 5 gave about what students could learn from them was systems and structure. And 5 for 5, what they felt like kids ministry could learn from our youth ministry was relationship building, relational ministry. And I thought, that's probably pretty accurate. If you were to go church to church, youth ministries are just notorious for being a little bit unorganized, a little bit not as concerned about systems, and really, really good at being relational. And children's ministry, probably the exact opposite.
Yeah, and some of it's just out of need, right? Like I think children's ministry it happens in a bunch of rooms. Like you can't, there's a measure where you could lead a student ministry of 60 with 5 volunteers. It's really hard to lead a children's ministry of 60 with 5 volunteers. You know what I mean?
Yep.
So,
and that speaks to the need for structure in kids ministry and the freedom for relationships in youth ministry. You can't just send out a text message saying, "Hey, I'm at Starbucks. The first 5 third graders to show up get free coffee." You don't have those same. Whereas with youth ministry, you can do relational ministry outside of the 4 walls of the church very easily, and with kids ministry, you just can't. And so there's some built-in reasons why I think those 2 glaring differences exist, and my hunch is they exist in kind of universally between the kids ministry and the youth ministry at a local church.
Yeah, I agree. I think those would have been my answers. I definitely was thinking relational. When you said what kids could learn from student ministry, I was thinking the relational side of it for sure. I feel like that, like relational ministry and kids ministry is still new. It's like a 10-year-old thing. Whereas I feel like it's always been in student ministry, back from the early days. So one thing that I'm seeing in ministry world, I hear leaders talking about all the time, we've talked about it a little bit on this podcast, is just the struggle that churches are having with high school ministry. There's just so many leaders, and student ministry overall is hard, but the high school ministry part seems to be harder. I was just with a church recently that church of 3,000, 3,500, something like that. They have 80 high schoolers coming on average, and they know they're there, they're part of their church, but just can't get them engaged. So are you seeing that? What do you think are some of the causes of
that? Great question. I think I see it as a whole, depending on who you talk to and what you read and what stats you're paying attention to. I think it's fair to say that as a whole, reaching high schoolers, the local church reaching high school students, is struggling in ways it probably hasn't in the past. I think a lot of times ministry is secular. So I would always encourage a church, until you've seen this trend be consistent for 4 or 5 years, I wouldn't necessarily start hitting the panic buttons yet. In most churches, your attendance in different departments kind of goes through these ebbs and flows, and it kind of cycles through, and you have massive peaks and valleys. But I do think most experts would agree that there seems to be a trend where youth group attendance, and evangelical church attendance in the United States is waning. We at our church, for us with 20 campuses, it almost goes campus by campus. Some of our campuses are booming. Their youth ministries are booming. Other campuses, our youth ministries are really, really struggling. I think if you were to try to get to some of the root factors, the United States is becoming more and more post-Christian, and I think that the church is, in large ways, we're to blame for this. We've done this to ourselves, and there's other cultural forces at play, but the church has lost a lot of its voice of influence. It's lost a lot of its credibility. And on one hand, people would say it's because the church has become too soft and it looks too much like culture. On the other hand, people would say it's because the church is still too dogmatic and we're not changing. And that there's probably degrees of truth and cause in all of, everything in between. But yeah, I think it's definitely tougher than ever. And I think it's forcing youth pastors to, I think you said before we started talking that next on one of your upcoming podcasts, you're going to interview Marco.
Yeah.
Marco Stryker. Yeah. And you probably won't have time to get into this piece of the conversation with him, but it would be fascinating. He's actually done a lot of talk about youth pastors needing to sort of redesign their job descriptions. And he'll even go so far as to say you need to give yourself a new title, that maybe your title should just be advocate for teenagers. And that kind of forces the church to think about new ways that we minister to teenagers. If you're the youth pastor, it kind of just reinforces how you do things the same way your church has always done them. If you're just the advocate for teenagers, it opens up the box of opportunity, the missional conversation versus attractional conversation of ministry. I think those are really good conversations to have. But I do think if churches just kind of assume, hey, we're just going to keep doing church the way we've always done it, we're going to do really great programming and tons of kids are going to flock to our front doors, I think that's probably partially faulty thinking in this day and age.
Yeah, and I feel like if you look back in American church history, student ministry oftentimes was the forefront of change for the whole church. You know what I mean? I feel like in many ways, seeker-sensitive church to me was youth ministry for grown-ups.
Right.
And maybe something new is needed. Maybe it's another time.
Sure. You go back to the history of Willow Creek. They're probably kind of the original seeker sensitive, and it started out. It was Hybels mostly doing youth ministry, and it kind of morphed. He kind of just grew up with it, and it morphed into a way of doing church. But then I get really nervous, Nick, about throwing the baby out with the bathwater. I think attractional ministry and good programming, I think there's still a big place for that. I don't like it when people try to force us into this missional camp or attractional camp. And I think we get convinced, or we get told that those two philosophies are opposed, mutually exclusive. Mm-hmm. And I don't think they are. I think they can both coexist really well. At Saddleback, we've kind of got a philosophy of, on the one hand, we're super strategic, we're purpose driven, we know why we exist, we know what programs we're going to do to reach what type of student. And at the same time, we just kind of have this philosophy of put lots of hooks in the water. Just try a bunch of different things because different people are attracted to different type of stuff. And trying to build a youth ministry that has stuff for kids who want to be missionally minded and they're a little bit deeper thinkers and have a deeper way of looking at life and theology. You don't want to exclude those students by being purely attractional. But being attractional is just the tip of the iceberg, and it's okay to have some really light, loose, attractional, fun stuff to reach the students who that's where they're at. So I kind of avoid putting myself into really confining camps if I can, because I want to do ministry however I can to reach as many students for Jesus and help them grow in their faith as we possibly can.
Yeah, I wonder if especially even high school, when they have more freedom and there's more that they're doing, everybody talks about kids are playing more sports, they're involved in more with school, which is all great things. And maybe, like you said, you have more hooks in the water, and a lot of churches are probably just measuring either attendance or group involvement or something. But if you could, maybe the part of the answer is look at the whole year for a student, and maybe they didn't come regularly to the one program because it conflicted with sports, but they were part of that other small group, that other hook in the water, or you met with them or whatever. When
I talk to people, the typical youth pastor would say, at their ongoing event, whether it's Sunday night or Wednesday night or whatever, they're kind of their large group gathering, if they do that philosophy of ministry, they're kind of saying that these days students to come once to twice a month. And those kids would consider that youth group their home. Those students would feel like, oh yeah, I'm a part of Second Baptist youth group, or I'm a part of this church's youth group, but they come once or twice a month. And it's because there's just so much other stuff demanding for their attention, competing for their attention, other expectations that parents have of them. Church attendance seems to be down as far as the consistency, and yet those same families who attend less, they wouldn't say they're any less committed to Jesus Christ. And they probably wouldn't even say they're less committed to their church. They would somehow say, yeah, we attend less than we used to, but we're no less committed. Now,
Yep.
pastors and number counters have a hard time
Yeah.
with
Yeah.
that, but that would be their heartfelt response. We love the church as much as we ever did. We just don't go as much. And so it does force us as pastors and youth pastors to go, okay, how else do we measure engagement and success, and what other ways can we advocate and minister to teenagers, knowing that the high schoolers in our community just aren't as committed to being at what we're doing. And some churches have chosen, well, we're going to double down. We're going to reclaim Sunday morning. We're going to reclaim the church hour. And I think that's honorable, and I think that can work. I think there's other approaches that are worth considering as well. And that's kind of the tough part, is you have to figure out and this is where I think high school youth groups can do themselves a great service or don't do themselves a disservice. Excuse me. Is I think it's good to talk to your whole church leadership about it. Like, hey, as a church leadership, what's our philosophy on this? What are we doing to engage our community so that the youth group isn't just kind of out there rogue and they're suddenly doing things in a whole different philosophy and a totally different way of thinking than the rest of the church. And that, in my experience, gives you some short-term wins sometimes, but long-term it kind of hurts your effectiveness as a ministry of the church.
Yeah. How about if you look at, like, I don't know, maybe 5 years of history of Saddleback student ministry, maybe just high school or maybe both junior high and high school, how much has changed with these times, or is a lot of it still the same and it's just small changes here and there?
You mean as far as the attendance and engagement, or just the type of kid we're reaching?
More your approach, the strategy.
Yeah.
Attendance engagement, if that's changed too, that'd probably be good to hear about. But like your approach to the strategy, the plan, has it largely stayed the same and that's been good, or have you had to make some shifts? I
would say it's largely stayed the same. And for us, it's been largely good. We have a very dialed in strategy and philosophy and methodology of doing youth ministry. And we've made some changes over the years. We've simplified some things. We've tried to clean some things up. But our strategy, for me, I would say this, Nick, our strategy has stayed 95% the same. How we implement the strategy and what the pieces of that look like, there's been quite a bit of change.
Okay.
So we are a crowd to core. You might call it like the traditional funnel, right? You bring them in, you build them up, you help them grow. For us, we have a statement. Our ministry exists to expose students to Christ, help them experience Christ, help them express Christ and the biblical purposes of his church. We have this purpose statement and a strategy, and it's totally crowd attractional and evangelism to core and missional and expressing Christ, his kingdom, and the purposes of his church. It's a dialed in system. But what the crowd programs look like, how we help kids experience their faith, what the expressions of faith in the community and in their schools look like, that stuff to us is always up for negotiation and always changing and tweaking to help us do what we do better. But we're committed to the expose, experience, express Christ, his kingdom, and his purposes. We're committed to that model of ministry. We just tweak what it looks like.
Real quick, for anybody who doesn't know, what is the core of that strategy in terms of the crowd thing, and what's that rhythm look like, and the core, getting them in groups? And my impression, and I'm assuming this is still the case, you all have always done a great job with groups, so much so that it, like, average participation in groups outpaces average attendance at your crowd gatherings sometimes. Is that the case in student ministry still?
Sure. For us, in our particular setting, again, it varies a little bit from campus to campus, but as a whole, yes. And I think I'll get to that when we talk about the small groups. But so for us, the purpose-driven model for us is simply to move students from not knowing about Jesus all the way through a discipleship process, a strategy that they move from not knowing about Jesus, not even caring about Jesus, that's the community kid, into our core student who is expressing the goodness of Jesus Christ in how he or she lives their life missionally outside of the walls of the church. And we have really three primary ways we do that. The large group gathering, which is the large group can be, if you have a youth group of 15 students, the large group is basically any time that you say, hey, everybody, this is when we get together. Bring your friends. It might not be a youth group of 1,000, but it's when you regularly get everybody together to do seeker-friendly, bring a friend to church. For us, that happens on the weekends, simultaneous to the adult services. So we have 2 on Saturday night and then 2 again on Sunday morning. And that's the crowd program. That's your typical youth group service. Everything that a lot of youth groups do on Sunday nights or Wednesday nights, we do it on Saturday and Sundays during adult services. Then that's our expose event. We expose students to Christ. Hope to get as many of those students as are interested to sign up to be part of a small group. And our small groups meet on Tuesday or Wednesday nights. They meet in homes in the community. They are designed to be the next step in their spiritual journey. So it moves from exposing them to Christ, his kingdom and his purposes, to experiencing Christ, his kingdom and his purposes in a deeper community for the purposes of fellowship and discipleship. So it's all next step stuff. And we try to hold our leaders accountable to making sure that just like the weekend is the value, the purpose is to expose them to these things. So it's never going to get overly deep on the weekends. And the beautiful thing about having a well dialed in strategy and purpose statement is when parents have issues or when there's questions, you can point and say, this is why we do it the way that we do it. So for us, when parents say the weekend's a little bit shallow, you're not doing a verse-by-verse study through Ecclesiastes. We say, hey, here's why. Because the purpose of the weekend is to expose students to the things of Jesus Christ. Now, at life group, at small groups, they're meant to be a little bit deeper. They're going to start experiencing this together. And so we try to hold our leaders accountable to making sure that the small groups are experiential in nature. It's not just talking head. There's a lot of praying for each other and encouraging each other, all the one another's that we see in Scripture. We want our life groups, our small groups, to be very much full of the one another's, carrying one another's burdens, holding one another accountable. All that kind of stuff is happening in our small groups. And then our ultimate goal, and this is kind of the target that we would paint on the wall, our ultimate bullseye is because the large group and the small group, those are really the two ongoing programs. And then we have all of this individual life stuff. So we move students from the large group to the small group, and then we focus on helping them as individuals express Christ, his kingdom, and the purpose of his church through their lifestyle. And so then we've just got all kinds of opportunities, whether it's ministry teams, self-paced growth tools, going on missions trips, serving in our kids' ministry, getting baptized, sharing their testimony. All of that is stuff that we encourage kids to do on their own because, you don't make a decision as a group to get baptized. It's an individual decision. And so that's our strategy, is to move kids from the crowd and the community into our expose church event, into an experience through a small group so that they can express Jesus in their lifestyle. That's kind of the way that we do it.
That's great. And do you still get pretty group participation that sometimes exceeds weekend participation? Oh, or is it? That
was your question, wasn't it?
Well, I've always heard that about Saddleback, yes, even with adults, and I figure that's still the case now.
Yeah. So for us, even though we would say for adults and kids and youth that small groups are the next deeper step, they are still very much anybody's welcome to come. So that's kind of the hook in the water. You're welcome to come to a small group, but small group may not be what you feel drawn to, but you're certainly welcome. And our attendance in small groups especially in junior high and high school, more so than children's. And I'm not sure about the adults, but for junior high and high school, if you were to count butts in the seats on a weekend and then count butts in the seats in a small group, the numbers would most weeks be very, very similar. Okay. And I think the reason for that goes back to the busyness of the weekends. Because if you were to stand in front of our youth group and say, how many of you are in a small group, only about half the hands would go up. Because so many kids are every other week, once a month kids. But every Wednesday night, they don't have soccer tournaments on Wednesday nights. They're not visiting their dad on Wednesday nights. No matter what's going on the weekend to draw them away from church, Wednesday night or Tuesday night for them is pretty consistent. And I think that's why our small group attendance is so high, is because it's just easier to be consistent on a Tuesday or a Wednesday than it is, especially in Southern California, on a weekend.
That's interesting, because I feel like some student ministries think the opposite almost. Like during the week, you're going to have practices. But you're right. A lot of sports things now are the weekend, especially Sunday. That's been, years ago, that wasn't necessarily the case, but Sunday's been taken over with sports. And so that's interesting that you're experiencing better consistency midweek than on the weekend.
I think the thing that has helped us is we've got, again, lots of hooks in the water. So if you've got a soccer tournament on Saturday, you can show up and still go to youth group on Sunday. So it gives you, twice the shot at going to church. And at small groups, you can pick Tuesday night or Wednesday night. So if you know that Wednesday night's a bad night for small group, then you have the option to sign up for Tuesday night. So I think we've kind of helped families keep church a viable option by giving them twice as many options for each of our programs.
Yeah, that's true. That's really good. I'm sure that helps a lot, because you have Saturday and Sunday, and you have Tuesday and Wednesday, so it makes it easier for people to even be involved in both.
Right.
How about you mentioned some of the campuses can be very different in terms of how student ministry is going and what that's like. Is there anything when you look at those campuses, the ones in the U.S., I'm thinking, are there patterns? Are there principles, about the campuses that are doing it well and the ones that are having a harder time? Or is part of it's just, you can't really put a finger on it? It's that ebbs and flows you talked about of the seasons.
Yeah, I think there are some real obvious. So for us, we always launch student ministries when we launch our church within the first couple months. And so as a result, sometimes we launch with a volunteer youth pastor. Sometimes we launch with a part-time youth pastor. Sometimes if we feel like, hey, this campus is going to be growing right out of the gate, we'll launch with a full-time youth pastor. And so I think part of the difference between growth and all that has to do with how much time that youth pastor is being able to spend focused on the youth group. So that's part of it. I think another piece is kind of our target audience in some communities. That's more, they're more receptive to it maybe than other communities. So the church is just growing and attracting people in those communities at a different pace. But a lot of it is the ebb and flow. I've just learned, Nick, so much of youth ministry is getting a little bit of momentum. And once you get a few wins under your belt and you get a little bit of momentum, I think some of the hardest growth is growing your youth group from 15 kids, 15 to 30, sometimes is harder growth, even though it's only 15 students. That's harder growth than growing from 40 to 100, even though that's 60 students, because there's just not much momentum. There's not much of a critical mass. There's not much happening yet in that youth group of 15. And so it's just hard to keep it going. So that's been kind of how I would look at it, is there's a lot of factors at play. But we do our best. We really try not to focus too much on the numbers and all that kind of stuff. We try to focus on just doing good, healthy youth ministry. And if you do good, healthy youth ministry, over time, it'll grow at the rate that God wants it to grow. Let's plant seeds and let's trust God for the growth.
Yeah. And I think something you kind of alluded to as well is one thing I've observed in student ministry is it does take time. Like it does take a while to build the foundation and meet and get some consistency and build the momentum. And maybe that's a pattern too, is some of the campuses have had someone for 3 years. And so now they're seeing it. And then maybe some are newer. or something like that too.
Yeah, and it does take time. And man, if there's people listening who are younger in youth ministry, I tell people all the time, if you're interviewing at a new church, one of the questions you have to ask is how quick, how do they define success, and how quickly are you expected to achieve that level of success?
Yeah, it's a good question.
Because me and you will sit here and we'll say, oh man, healthy youth ministry takes time. And we know that to be true. And yet so many of us work in settings where we're not given the time to build a healthy youth ministry. We want, or the church we work for wants to see that youth group grow from 15 to 30 in 2 months. They want it to go from 60 to 100 in a few months. And it just puts this really tough, borderline, completely unrealistic expectation. And we trust that as you build a team of adults, as you do good, healthy youth ministry, as you gain the trust of parents, that this thing over time is going to morph and grow into something really healthy and good. But that's pretty rare in most churches to give that kind of grace.
Yeah, that's true. All right, I'll say second to last question. The last one will be real short, but this question, maybe there's something that pops in your mind, maybe not. Where are you experiencing momentum the most in student ministry at Saddleback right now? Like one specific area, one part of the strategy, where are you getting the most momentum right now?
Yeah, I think we are probably experiencing the most momentum in two areas, kind of at the top and the bottom of the funnel. Our youth ministry is growing. So for us, it's funny to me, Saddleback sometimes gets dinged as, I've heard it be teased as a 90s model of youth ministry, and because it hasn't changed a ton since the 90s when we started doing purpose-driven youth ministry. And we just keep oiling that machine. We believe in the way we do youth ministry, and our youth ministry numerically is growing. So we're kind of in a boom season right now, but simultaneously, we're also really experiencing a ton of momentum in our students owning ministry and using their gifts and expressing how God's wired them and shaped them. We've got more students serving in kids ministry than we ever have. This almost overly massively successful music ministry where students are leading all of our bands and our music. So the one thing that's kind of holding super, super steady is our small groups. Year after year after year, our attendance at our small groups and what's happening in small groups is really, really consistent. And the front end, the crowd community stuff, our large group gatherings, and all of our individual life stuff is what seems to ebb and flow the most. And we're just kind of booming right now in both of those areas.
That's great. And I wonder if the second fuels the first. You know what I mean? The second thing you mentioned is fueling the growth in the first thing.
I think it's totally doing that. I hope so. Because I do believe that the days of doing such an awesome youth ministry program, having the best music, having a sweet youth room, having really funny and engaging messages, whatever it is that we think is going to draw kids to come. The reality is what grows your youth ministry is having what we would call, in our context, we call them bringers. And those are just the students in your youth group who are on fire for Jesus. They love Jesus way more than the youth group. And they're talking about Jesus all the time. And of course they bring their friends to youth group because youth group is a place where life change happens, and they know their lost friends need to be part of a community that's going to be encouraging and safe and loving and warm. You want those bringers to be excited to bring their friends to church because church is a great experience. And if youth group sucks, then those bringers aren't as likely to bring their unchurched friends to church, to youth group, because it's embarrassing and it doesn't represent Christ. It doesn't represent the fullness of life that these kids are trying to tell their friends all about. So I do think the bottom feeds the top, and I think a vibrant, exposed program helps kids be excited about their faith and then want to join a small group and want to get baptize and want to share their testimony. So to me, it's a baseball diamond, it's a funnel, it's a concentric circles, whatever you want to call it, of just moving people out of the crowd into the core so that they go back out in the world and bring their friends back into the crowd. It's a self-feeding process, hopefully.
Yeah. Well, that whole strategy right there is one reason why Saddleback Church and student ministry has succeeded for all these years, whether it was created in the 80s or 90s or not. That strategy is good. It's still good. You know what I mean? And churches are, for the most part, I think, all trying to do the same thing, even if they call it something else, right? That's what they're trying to do.
Yeah, I think so. I think we're all in the business, I hope we're all in the business of reaching as many lost teenagers for Jesus as we can and helping as many of those as we can. I hope that's what we're about. And that's kind of all we're trying to do. We've just done it the same way with the same strategy for years and years. But like I said at the beginning, if you took a snapshot of how we're doing it today versus 20 years ago, it looks way different. The experience is way different. The programs are way different, but the strategies remain the same.
Yeah, that's good. Well, I really appreciate you taking this time. How can people connect with you if they have any questions? We're going to link to some of the things you've written, so they'll be able to get a hold of that easily. But is there any way that people can connect with you or follow you on social media? Sure.
Yeah. All of my social media is just Kurt Johnston. So Twitter's at Kurt Johnston. Instagram is Kurt Johnston. If people have specific questions, I'm happy. They can email me. My email is just Kurt, K-U-R-T, at saddleback.com. I love interacting and talking to youth workers. So anything I can do to help and cheer people on, I love to be a part of doing that.
Awesome, Kurt. Well, thank you so much for coming on the podcast and for taking this time to talk student ministry with us.
Hey, Nick, thanks so much for letting me be a part of it.
Well, I don't know about you, but I really enjoyed learning from Kurt there and getting his thoughts on the struggles that I think a lot of churches are having with high school ministry and even student ministry overall. I really enjoyed hearing what their strategy is, even though I already knew that, but just how has that changed or really not changed in 5 or 10 years? They've changed like what it looked like or how it executes or maybe some of the specifics like he mentioned, but they haven't changed the core of the strategy, and it's worked really, really well for them. And I just continue to be reminded that I think longevity and consistency and patience are keys to successful student ministry. There are some action items I thought of coming out of that interview. One is to map out your strategy. Many of you that listened to this probably did not listen last week because it was about children's ministry, but that was the same. One of the same action items there was, what is your strategy? What are the components? What is the purpose of each component? How do they work together? How does a new student progress through the strategy? And then another action item would be to think about measuring involvement and attendance and engagement in your student ministry differently. What if it is not so much about weekly attendance in one environment, but they did one thing if you have different groups than large group, or you look at it more like on the year, how many students participated in a certain percentage or, so many seasons, if you look at it like semesters or something like that throughout the year. I think that would be helpful because there are a lot of demands on students' time, and Kurt even referenced how they're attending less, and we know that everybody's attending church less frequently. So how do we adjust that to make sure that we're not just looking at it like, oh, they don't care about church anymore, because that may not be true at all. I also thought about his idea of having many hooks in the water. I think if you're a church that has 30 students, there may not be a lot of like strategic programming hooks in the water, but that's where you can be more relational. So where are the different opportunities, whether through relationships or even through programming, that you can have more hooks in the water, more opportunities for students to be involved and to engage, so that if the one thing you have doesn't work out for them, they can still be plugged in. I thought that was really helpful. So maybe have a conversation about that. You can get all the links and notes and everything at nickblevins.com/episode 97. Getting close here to 100 episodes, which is great. Thank you all. I can't believe it's 100 episodes. And on one hand, it feels like it's been going for a while, but on the other hand, that seems really fast. So thanks for listening. Thanks for sharing. Thanks for leaving ratings and reviews on iTunes and wherever you listen. I really appreciate that. So I look forward to the conversation next week. I know you will as well. If you heard what Kurt mentioned in there, he kind of teased who the guest is probably going to be, and it's going to be a good one. So if you don't miss it, make sure you subscribe. Until then, hope you have a great week.
Thanks for listening to the Nick Blevins Family Ministry Podcast. We hope this helps you maximize your church's potential. We would love to hear stories of how you apply what you've learned. You can do that by leaving a comment on iTunes or in the show notes at nickblevins.com.